right, we have one more paper left in this session, and that is Shrayon Chanda speaking on Machiavelli, Salazar Slytherin, and an honest understanding of power.
Hi, my name is Shrayon. I'm from India, Mumbai, India, and I have been like listening to all of you guys. It was brilliant to listen to so many different kinds of takes on uh, the Potterverse and everything. I am a student of history, and very interestingly, what Patrick said right now about like that quote of Dumbledore in that King's Cross Station, kind of King's Cross Station. Now, I'm starting my paper with that quote only, so I love the way it ended with Henrik. So my paper is Machiavelli, Salazar Slytherin, and an honest understanding of power. Um, so yeah, I start with that quote that, of course, it is happening inside your head, Harry, but why on earth should that mean it's not real? Like more than a decade down the line after Dumbledore said this and just vanished, I can blatantly accept right now that this has been my greatest armor in justifying all the ramblings that I will go on for in the next few minutes. Um, Reality in itself has like fascinated me a lot. I feel it's like a tricky thing to deal with. What is reality, to be honest? What qualifies as reality and what does not? Is it all about just what's seen and what's felt and heard, or is it something beyond the threshold of a palpable existence? Imageries can be crucial as per human psychological paradigms for the understanding of anything and everything. And honestly, as per Nonika Dotto's understanding of reality and binaries as a social scientist, it is increasingly crucial for us to realize the importance of transcending the borders of a binary based social study. And it's not only about the Potterverse, but in general, the tendencies of simplifying and elucidating everything and anything in the quest for labels and verdicts and opinions can actually be an ignoring of several potentials, I feel. Here is where I bring in Machiavelli. So, like Niccolo Machiavelli is one such person who divided opinions like arguably no one else, with Hitler, Francis, Hobbes, and Gramsci all respecting him, the Catholic Church getting offended by him, and Shakespearean plays getting a new Machiavellian character arc now and then. Very typical of pop culture, though, grasping one end of the spectrum with pomp and grandeur and making it the most well known part of it. And as a result, the most well known adjective after Machiavelli is notorious. Hold on to that thought, please, everyone. We will just come back to it very soon. On the other hand, is the Slytherin House of Hogwarts, with everyone right from its founder to the students associated with it, always shown in a slightly colored light. Yes, thanks to social media and popular culture working hand in hand to marketize the idea of Gryffindors, like all Gryffindors not being brave and all Slytherins not being selfish, there's a clear-cut tendency, I feel, to exceptionalize the Peter Pettigrews and the Severus Snapes. And this is where the question I feel arises that why is there such a need for an antagonist? I think so many years down the line, we can be sure of one thing that Gryffindors of all people are not foolproof. And I think it's better to understand and keep this out of the way that there are a lot of people in our own lives and as well as the fictional worlds that people can fight for the better and still not be the best people to like hang around with Bandangas Fletcher and Rufus Scrimger and uh, Cornelius Fudge being some examples like that. On the other hand, it's important to also not dwell into how much crucial and brave and kind of selfless were the acts of Slughorn, Narcissa Malfoy, Regulus Black, and perhaps Luna and Xenophilius Lovegood as well. So, with all due respect to the storyline's obsession with the chosen one, I'll call it the chosen oneism and whatnot. Why is there this singling out of this one Slytherin as to a 3:1 ratio of for the Hogwarts population? This is where my own obsession, I'm guilty about it. This is where my own obsession with binaries kind of trickle in. Binaries are also an interesting thing to deal with. And Nonika Dotto again, in her thesis work, says a very interesting line. Although she deals with a different domain altogether, she interacts with human opinions and emotions and perspectives and how perspectives can clash, conflict, argue, fight, but must not overshadow. And in the end, be it political thinking or through literature or through social studies, human emotions and reactions and perspectives are the rawest forms of sources we have for anything and everything. She says, I'm quoting her, there are many versions of the same story, insofar as a story diversely told can be conceived of as the same story. There is no hierarchy of events. Multiple stories, however inconsistent and contradictory, are juxtaposed with one another. No one version supersedes the other. The quest is not for a single historical truth or a final answer. Each story, somewhat incomplete, stands on its own. The quest is not for a single truth or answer yet again. So whether Machiavelli was a villain maker or whether Salazar Slytherin or the Slytherin House as a whole was basically a cruelly fundamentalist character, let's keep these labelings out of the way for once, shall we? Ends justify the means. Apparently, this is the phrase which is notoriously encircling the legacy of Machiavelli, conveniently describing the popular perceived notion regarding The Prince, one of his best works, I feel, and its architect in a nutshell. Um, Debates of Machiavelli's idea of politics have raged on throughout decades and centuries, and writing anything about Machiavelli or the Prince requires a decent amount of courage and precision because of the all-encompassing image that this philosopher has. So, influences of Machiavelli or the Prince have been scattered across generations, from Shakespeare to Christopher Marlowe, like the talks of the dubious characteristic under the name of Machiavel in the Jew of Malta by Marlowe, or or like Richard Duke of Gloucester in Shakespeare's Henry VI, the part 3. The relevance of the term Machiavellian was in full flow ever since the 16th century when the manuscripts of the Prince began to be circulated. Machiavelli was smoothly transcended into a synonym of nasty politics. Machiavellian started to be used as a description of dubious, self-centered character in plays. Remember these characteristics, please. And the popular imagery of the Italian philosopher and his work was not in any way celebratory. But again, here I will just first of all put forward another term. In a parallel, the popular reception and representation of Machiavelli could be somewhat similar to the dubious one-sided presentation of Slytherin House across throughout the Potterverse. Interestingly, I would put forward another term, largely associated with Grindelwald and Dumbledore when they were going upon a grey path, but also crucial in this discussion, that is, for the greater good. Sounds eerily similar to the ends justified to the means, right? Both these terms somehow talk of a moral high ground and an unapologetic association with ambition and power. And anyone who is well versed in Potterverse will know the amount of power knowledge can bring, where Dumbledore and Grindelwald also becomes very important characters for our discussion. And it is somehow for the greater good, whatever power the powerful decides to do with this. Be it the question of purity or the questions of who holds the dice or anything, there's always a promise of a long term, a far-sightedness, and ends justifying the means kind of understanding of time and space and roles and paradigms. Machiavelli also talks of the same thing, that after one becomes a ruler, it is crucial that he ensures that all the people whose help he enlisted to become the ruler, to get to the throne, should be either vanquished or removed or perhaps even killed. Ambition, notoriety, cunningness, ruthlessness, virtues do seem eerily similar to the Slytherin house. There's a teasing question in this aspect. Just maybe, Machiavelli might be an inspiration for this house. Even if it wasn't, it's a text all the same. And this is how my politics would align with the Potter College. Although fiction, although fiction, during the repeated description of the four houses of Hogwarts, anytime in the series, be it the movies actually even more blatantly, and I guess also kind of shamelessly, uh, it shows the fact that the House of Slytherin always got the label of cunningness and selfish, ambition-oriented outlooks, which can be an astute parallel in which Machiavelli was shown in the popular light. While on one hand, the popular notion regarding the prince is that it almost serves as a manual for tyrannies to grow, it might also be too primitive and premature and unfair to paint Machiavelli in such a light. As we have seen in every instance of history and civilizations and life in general, binary assessment, I'm sorry again, binary assessment of anything usually ends up having a lot of shortcomings. And here we are talking about A, one of the most well-known works of history, and B, and a, a series which has warped our minds and lives in the way that arguably a lot of others have not. So it's not quite fair to paint these creatures, these characters, sorry, not creatures, these characters and these creators in a monochromatic color. Now I think it's better if we can just I can give you a more elaborate like outlook as to what I'm trying to do. Is that what I'm trying to come at is that people love to have a target, a villain, be it the Machiavelli of the Jew of Malta, or the Salazar Slytherin, or the global Middle East, or the Cold War days. There has always been a David and there's always been a Goliath. But in most of the cases, the situations are much more diverse, to be very honest. The way Machiavelli was received and perceived in a very one sided light is testimonial to how short sighted it is to label something or someone. To be fair, with this work of his, Machiavelli brought upon himself the irks of quite a few sections, very diverse sections of the European civilization, not only the church or the political moralists, but somehow the legacy of his works were a bit overshadowed by the negative publicity received by the prince. On the other hand, they simply failed to ignore it or seize the fire that it apparently started. Similarly, Salazar Slytherin and the Slytherin House somehow fall in the same trope. The reception and the general perception of this house and everyone associated with it falls in the same fashion as Machiavelli, a known notorious part of the school, with Snape being exception, like grayish, grayish exception. So apart from the reception in Europe and in theatrical perspective, what Machiavelli tried to do with Prince was like a manual for everyone who tries to seek power or seeks to preserve their power. In this sentence, it might feel like it's like a governance kind of a manual or something, but it's much more than that. And because the prince transcended politics and philosophy and societal ethics and human psychology, giving birth to a work which has since then been under the toughest of scanners, the basis of the prince is that Machiavelli strongly believed that greed and neediness is ingrained in human nature and thereby conflict is unavoidable. From a perspective, this whole approach of presenting the political framework seems to be a bit pessimistic, yes, perhaps even immoral. But can we question that perhaps Machiavelli actually wanted to like like a seeping nature, like an undercurrent, try to help us in recognizing how a rule, how a state, how a throne can become a tyrant. So that is how I feel like understanding Machiavelli. It's much more than that one-sided nature of being called him being called a tyrant maker. But still, somehow Machiavelli manages to cater to a perspective as a strictly pessimistic character for very obvious reasons. From the very onset of Prince, it is very clear that Machiavelli didn't believe in the republics and principalities that Aristotle and Plato and Augustine talked about. He quotes, "Many have imagined republics and principalities that have never been seen or known to exist in truth, for it is so far from how one lives or how one should live that he who lets go of what is done or what should be done learns his ruin rather than his preservation." Unlike the virtuous vision of his predecessors, Machiavelli proposes rulers to be able to be not good according to the necessity. So this cold-bloodedness, this deception, this notoriousness, very similar to what Slytherin is known as. So Machiavelli literally propagates a garb of fear, a delusion, in order to contain the common people by often calling them vulgar. According to them, the vulgar and the fickle crowd is almost always taken by appearances. And here I again bring attention to one word: fickle. Fickleness is another thing that I'm very interested in when I'm talking about Slytherin and in general human nature, because it's like this is where Machiavelli becomes so very much like Slytherin, absolutely unignorable, regardless of how much you detest or portray them in the wrong, in the worst of lies. And just like the fictional Machiavellis and Machiavellian entities, the prince turns out to be this cunning work of political theory. That is where the brilliance of Prince and Slytherin lies. No one can actually speculate the entire picture. And of course, these threads of speculation will always be there. It will never end. It is unpredictable. It has a number of shades, and it will never be bound by any binary of thought. There are so many potential understandings of the prince, of Machiavelli himself, and of Slytherin House, and all the students of that house, that it seems as if layers of narratives can be threaded from the study of the text. It can be a manual, it can be a book of warnings, it can be a satire, it can be anything, it can be blatantly just actually vulgar, but and all of them at once. And to be honest, this is what makes Slytherin and the prince itself so palpable, that it can be anything and everything that is humanely possible. There is no lust for utopia here. Machiavelli emphasizes his work on the world in which civilizations are built, albeit pessimistic at times, but attempts at assessing the art of politics from a very honest point of view. Brings me back to my title, that's the honest understanding of power. It is because of this astute honesty and brave take on tyranny that Machiavelli still has the time before gathering dust in the shells of the world. And we come back to the Potterverse. I would like now to focus on the imageries of Slytherin and try to connect it with the reception of Machiavelli. There's this tendency throughout this series to make it a tussle between the good and the bad, but we, of all people, we must know that the Potterverse is far more complex and multi-layered than that easy binary of good and bad. Perhaps there can be another way of looking at this, perhaps more than one way of looking at it. But as far as it goes to understanding why the binary was necessary, it is also crucial to know that it can just be another shrewd way of understanding fundamentalist and essentially fascistic tendencies. Just how Machiavelli was received or not received, to be very honest, in this case very as well. There can be a possibility for Slytherin to be used as an example, as a marker of sorts for red flags in order to understand tendencies which can adhere to something very close to extremist right-wing politics. And such unfortunate Easter eggs are all over the world across time, be it refugee issues, be it issues of reservation, or that of Brexit, or the villainization of some very crucial ideologies and practices, not to forget the obsession of the present day world to legitimize everything that is happening in Gaza, and how very easily popular culture has decided to kind of ostracize Russian people in different domains. All these feel like decisions taken at the frivolous of moments, fickle, if I may remind you again, with a substantial lack of depth and perhaps even a kind of prejudiced understanding of politics and identity and whatnot. It's like claiming this part of the society or the world to be dubious and problematic and trying to get rid of it, but without actually assessing it with depth and proper knowledge and discussion and understanding. It's extremely crucial to understand how Machiavelli wrote The Prince, and that it could have been an underlying essence of trying to recognize the red flags of a tyranny. But somehow the surface way of assessing his work was that of Machiavelli being a tyrant maker, his work being like being like a module for tyrants to get like absolute power in their hands. And somehow this spills over, exposing a basic human tendency of being reactionary, being fickle, and adhering to binaries. Potterverse, if anything, is the last place where anything and everything is good or bad. There are good wizards, there are bad wizards, there are so many others who do not fall in these Venn diagrams. And that is where basic human existence, and that is what basic human existence feels like. It is gray, it is full of layers and faults, and most important than anything else is that this comes with context. Perhaps the biggest example is Draco when it comes to Slytherin. I am not trying to whitewash the Malfoys. I am the last person to do that. But past is crucial. Roots are crucial. And while it is important to adhere to the virtues and characteristics of a Slytherin, one cannot forget that there are other human pivotal factors as well. That is why the spillage happens in the narratives of the Death Eaters as well. Narcissus and Malfoy decides that all the identities of a Death Eater, all of the ideologies, everything is almost equal to nothing when it's compared to her identity as a parent. Or when Harry says to Slughorn, "Be brave, Professor. Be brave like my mother." So bravery isn't exceptional to just the Gryffindors, and to be very honest, it's not only exceptional for the Slytherins in the case of just Snape. It's much more than that. I would like to take one more example in the end. Whenever there's a riot, there's always a tendency to recognize the victim and the perpetrator, but seldom is there that in-depth analysis taken into consideration. Perhaps the violence inflicted was a forced violence. Perhaps it was more than that. Perhaps it had a lot of more psychological effects to it. And because we just wanted to have a good David and a Goliath, we didn't look at it. And we just termed some communities as the perpetrator and some communities as the victim. It's never that simple when we try to understand Death Eaters as well. Fundamentalism and prejudice and discriminative behaviors are obviously never sought after, but yet again, a lot of violence are actually forced violence. Human beings are extremely complex and somewhat doomed characters. The way Machiavelli was received in hindsight shows the futility of binary specific behaviors and the treatment Slytherin received throughout the main narrative in the Potterverse and after that in the popular cultural domain as in general shows how binaries are seen in the human psyche. With a few commercially successful examples like Snape and Pettigrew, there's this tendency of generalizing these virtues and characteristics. Us, of all people, should know how social virtues and layers are seeped in the Potterverse, be it about violence or prejudice or discrimination and so on and so forth. But in some cases, it does end up being slightly borderline naive, more so in terms of movies, due to its obsession with what I call the chosen oneism. In the end, I'm coming back to where I started. It's a human tendency to have a villain, a target, someone or something to put the blame on, punching bag. But when it comes to power politics, blame games, and getting a punching bag, is very convenient for human mindsets. Machiavelli served this role to perfection in the 16th century, and Salazar Slytherin and the Slytherins in general kind of took up the mantle in the 21st. Slytherin, just like the prince, would continue to divide opinions, and I guess that's why, on a very personal note, I'm kind of in love with it. But keeping my regular blushings aside, um, I think it's important to connote how Slytherin can actually help in recognizing the vices around us, the tendencies which can have extremism as an undercurrent, and maybe intolerance as a whole. Power in its entirety across different faces and forms brings about a ruthlessness and ambitiousness, something that everyone dabbled with, ranging from Salazar Slytherin to Dumbledore to Grindelwald to Voldemort to Harry and everyone. And that is where Slytherin becomes so brilliant and at the same time so similar to Machiavelli's understanding of power, because what this results in is a human reaction to power. And I'm not only talking about statehoods and rulers, but power, strength, dominance in general. It's human enough to want to be powerful. And that is not a vice. Calling it a vice actually kinds of restricts the entire understanding of human emotions in its entirety, human reactions, human actions, human emotions, absolutely everything. Slytherin is humane with a deliberate colored ideation which feels like a deliberate creation of a binary to glorify some other narratives. Well, in the end, I would just like to remind that Machiavelli challenged the Aristotles and the Platos, and somehow the narratives of a Slytherin would continue to transcend and break many more walls than any other house of Hogwarts. Perhaps essentially because it is it's unignorable, and just like Machiavelli, it's so much more closer to being human if we look at it without the prism of the majoritarian chosen oneist methods. Thank you. That's all.